right, all right. Peace and love to everyone out there that's watching or listening. This is Brother Garfield, and I have an esteemed guest today, someone who I have admired for a long period of time, who wrote one of the biggest influences on my life. The book is called Israelite Religion. And I want to introduce everybody to Dr. Richard S. Hess. And I have to say the S because if you Google him, there is another Richard Hess out there. And I'm not going to say he's an imposter, but he's also in the field of academia, I assume. So that's why he uses the S. Or maybe he's trying to be a little extra special, Richard S. Well, how are you doing, Doctor? How are you doing today?
Oh, thanks, Garfield. I'm very well. I'm doing real well. I feel good. Just staying healthy and just feeling fine.
All right, beautiful, beautiful. First of all, I'm going to allow you to tell us a little bit about yourself as far as your academic credentials and so forth. But what I do know about you is that you're actually at the Denver Seminary. You're one of the teachers there. You specialize in Old Testament history. And that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to your book, Israelite Religion. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this field and so forth?
Yeah, well, I think probably the thing that tended to drive me in this direction all the way back into high school years was my faith, my Christian faith, and that led me in the sense of perhaps preparing for some kind of ministry or something like that. And so I went from there to a college, and I thought, well, I'm going to go to seminary and study. And so, but I want to do something in college to do more of a general sort of background. So I did archaeology and I did ancient languages, and then went to seminary and felt that my sort of became more and more interested in academics. So I went to a Christian seminary, and then I did my doctorate at actually a Jewish rabbinic school, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. So it gave me a kind of perspective that I thought was very, very important. And then I did a number of postdoc research work. I spent time in Chicago at the university there. I was in Israel, based there at the American Research Institute there. And then I was in Cambridge in England for a couple of years, and in Sheffield working on a Hebrew dictionary project. Then I moved on to doing more full-time teaching after that. That was all kind of research. And so I've taught in Scotland, I've taught in London, and then the last 20 plus years I've taught here at Denver Seminary in Colorado. So.
Okay. All right, so you definitely have a lot of credentials. You have your degrees and so forth. What as I said, attracted to me basically when I was reading Israelite religions. I'm going through the first chapter, the second chapters, and chapter 5 I think is the one that deals with a lot of West Semitic stuff that really a lot of the folks who follow the Bible should read, whether they're in my community or any community. Is the methodology you applied. You broke down the documentary hypothesis. And that's my main thing. When I read a book, I want to see what type of methodology you're using. Is this guy some nut that's trying to make up something, or is he serious about applying a methodology? So break down, how do you normally approach scholarship if you're writing a book or as far as teaching your students?
Yeah, well, I think my method, I would like to think of it as very source-based. It's based on in anything like this, on the ancient sources, and both trying to develop an understanding of what the texts are saying, the ancient texts in the original languages that they're written in, and then also the material culture, as it's called, the archaeology, and understanding that. And while I certainly have my conclusions and views, I do respect what I would call mainstream research and scholarship. And I tend to see that as important and valuable. So I will look at the books and articles and material that's been written and published, analyzing those sources. And then I will seek to evaluate that in light of what I've learned and understand in terms of the my reading of the texts and my looking at the archaeology. And so that's and I attempt to use a broad-based method. So I'm really interested in both the historical, the literary, the ideological, the linguistic, and just bringing all of those different tools together, as many as possible, to evaluate material using an empirically, I would say, an empirically based approach. That is, basing it on the original textual data and things like this, and seeing what is actually said.
Okay.
I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. In your early years of research, who were some of the scholars' works you studied in helping you grow as far as where you are today?
Right. Well, I certainly think early on I was influenced by William Albright, who was one of the great, he used the term biblical archaeologists of the 20th century, and a number of his students as well who went on to do work. People like Frank Cross, David Noel Friedman. I was also influenced by some of the major Assyriologists. I think of Wilfrid Lambert in Birmingham and London, and also scholars like Dietrich and Loretz, who have done a lot of work on Ugarit in Germany, in Munster, Germany. And then very much influenced in my particular areas of interest by people like Anson Rainey, the late Anson Rainey, who worked out of Tel Aviv University in Israel. Methodologically influenced some by mentoring people like Philip King, the late Philip King, who just he's both a wonderful person and a person who really worked in the archaeology and the material culture. So those are a number of figures that had impact, I would say, upon me. Yeah.
Okay. All right. What were you a believer? I think you mentioned earlier your Christian faith. Were you a believer before? Were you a fundamentalist before you went into school? Pretty much.
Yeah, I probably lay more in that area, a fundamentalist area, in terms of my own understanding and interpretation of the Bible before I sort of learned and had tools and other things to work with it.
Okay. One of the things, let's get to the Israelite religion, the book, by the way, and I'm gonna share with you guys because I do have it actually as an ebook on my computer. What made you write that book? What came to Dr. Richard Hess like, you know what, I need to write this book about Israelite religions, and why name it Israelite religions?
Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting because I had done some work and publishing a few things. I had done work on a commentary on the book of Joshua, was doing some work, I think, on a commentary on Leviticus. And what happened was I had some publishers, the publishers of the book, Baker, some representatives from there. And we got together at a professional meeting and they said, well, we'd like you to do something for us. What do you think would be good or you could bring together? And I'd been thinking about this for a while because this book, I began researching right around 2000. And in the 1990s, there was a lot being written about kind of what you might call an evolutionary understanding of belief in of Israel's religion and its belief in God. That is, it assumed that there were originally, way back when Israel began, the Israelites believed in multiple gods, maybe many gods, and then gradually over time, this evolved into belief in a single God. And I wasn't convinced of this particular view. I certainly believe that Israelites at any one time, you had a variety of different beliefs, but that kind of, there was no belief in a single God until the 7th or 6th or 5th centuries BC. I found that difficult. And so I said, I'd like to do a book on this topic. and more generally, something that could be a textbook. I had begun to teach a course in Israelite religion, and I realized that there really wasn't a good, what I would call a good textbook out there that was available that introduced a person to the ideas of religion and this study, and then looked at the evidence and sought to interpret it, and also appreciated the differing views that existed in the scholarly world. So they said, yeah, let's try it. So so we started work on it, and over the next 6 years or so, worked away, and the book is a result of that project.
Beautiful, beautiful. And by the way, I saw your comment in the book when you thanked the people, you thanked the Denver Seminary because they had to give you like a sabbatical to actually do some of the inside research. So shout out to them too. Without them, hey, that's your lifeline right there. So
absolutely, yeah.
All right. Let's talk about the God El, the reference to El and Yahweh, and you talked about the comparisons. Why do you feel right now today? Because the book was written, I think, 2009, 2007.
Yeah, 2006, 7. That's when it came out.
Around how do you feel today in 2021 as far as El and Yahweh? The comparisons you gave, you're like, from what I got from reading the book, that Yahweh pretty much took on a lot of the attributes of El, the Canaanite deity, and that pretty much El was the God of Israel, but with the theophoric name Israel, that's self-explanatory. So can you talk about the comparisons you talked about in the book?
Yeah, I can try. Even in the Bible, in Exodus 3 and Exodus 6, when God reveals himself to Moses in those texts, he says, to those, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, back in Genesis, but I did not reveal myself as Yahweh or Jehovah, or however the name is to be pronounced. I did not reveal. I revealed myself as El, a particular form of El Shaddai, God of the mountains or of the armies. Mm-hmm. But I think for sure the god El was known in that region and worshipped in different forms in different ways. We have what I believe really predates Moses, the city along the coast of what is today Syria, the city called Ugarit. And at Ugarit, there were a lot of mythological texts written around 1300, 1200 BC that recount the adventures of this god El, who there is portrayed as kind of the senior god of a whole pantheon, a whole group of gods and goddesses. And he and his consort is Asherah, and the two of them kind of procreate all the rest of the deities. So El was known. He was known even earlier than that. You can go back 1,000 years and you have attestations of this god El. But the name of the God of Israel, Jehovah or Yahweh, I usually go by the term Yahweh, although that's not absolutely certain. But this God, he did not reveal his name to Israel, even in the Bible, until he revealed it to Moses. And the earliest attestation of this name in an association with Israel is probably the Meshastila, a Moabite text from around the 9th century BC. So it comes in a little bit later. Now, clearly, he is portrayed both in the Bible and outside of the Bible as either the only God of Israel, or for some Israelites, he was at least the chief or state deity at the head of the state, and then maybe there were a few other gods around. So he's very unique. And in that sense, I think he continues the tradition of El as at the head of the pantheon, at the head of the gods and everything else. But in my view, around 1200, 1100, 1000 BC, around that time, the El becomes less of a specific name of one god and becomes more commonly the name of God. And we have this coming into the Bible, and I think some of the early poetry in the Bible maybe Genesis 15, Psalm 68, Habakkuk 3, possibly Deuteronomy 34, certainly Exodus 15, that and Judges 5. A number of these, reflect this kind of figure of El as a god, but also then El becomes more the name, the generic name for God. This is God in general. And in the Bible, the most common name for God, whether it's the God of Israel or worshiping other gods, is Elohim, which is almost certainly a form of El that is taken from that. So that's my understanding. You certainly have the name El being used of gods, not only in Israel, but in the surrounding nations of their world at the right through the Old Testament period.
All right. Let me go into something a little bit more with El. So why did, if El was the major god or the god, and Elohim, as what you just said, was used more than any other deity's name within the Old Testament, what caused, in your opinion, the movement forward to more of a Yahwistic worship than El? Was it, and let me preface that by saying, was it the Deuteronomists doing this? Was it the people in Judah, the priesthood? Was it who? Why did they move from El to Yahweh, in your professional opinion?
That's a really good question. good question. What's happening around 1100, 1200, 1100, 1000 BC is a number of, I would call, nations or states are forming. There's Israel and Judah that we know of, but there's also Ammon, the Ammonites in what is today Jordan. There's Moab east of the Dead Sea in Jordan. There's Edom farther south. There's the Arameans are more complicated, and the Phoenicians, but they're also forming city-states and things like this. And for each of these nationalities, there is a separate god that has a specific name that seems to be associated with them. You have the god of Moab is Chemosh, the god of Ammon is Milcom. Now, some of these are revealed in the Bible, but they're also attested in their own inscriptional material. And it seems as though these national or state deities, and in Israel and Judah, that's Yahweh, replace the focus of worship anyway in the ritual and cultic texts and the worship texts, replace the figure of El, possibly because of a greater nationalism or interest in their own country. The Bible itself claims that God revealed himself this way to Moses at the very beginning of Israel's history. And as I said, the name is associated with Israel as early as the 9th century outside of the Bible, and is the only god associated with Israel by a foreigner like the king of Moab. The name may appear in an inscription from around as early as the 14th century BC, even earlier, I would say, than Moses, in a place name possibly located in and around the Sinai, where Yahweh is named as part of that. It's kind of a name of a group of Bedouin called the Shasu of Yahweh. So it seems as though this is designed to identify a distinctive people, the people of Yahweh, who worship Yahweh as their God. And so the religion is very strongly connected with the nation and the people. And in order to do that, I think part of the purpose and reason is to move beyond the more general name El and move to the specific identification of the personal name, more personal name of Yahweh. I'm not sure what Yahweh means. I know that in Exodus, when God reveals himself, he says, "I am who I am." And some of those words in the Hebrew sound a little bit like Yahweh, but the actual name Yahweh doesn't fit in the grammar of Hebrew that way. So it may be a wordplay, and I think part of it is that we really don't know the origins of that name beyond what is portrayed in the Bible.
Wow, very, very good. All right, so I'm looking at, and by the way, let me give a the shirt I have on is from the Paradigm crew, and they have something called the Ruth Project. And these are a few men in the African American community that could speak or understand West Semitic languages. They could read Akkadian, Assyrian, they know the Hebrew, so they know the scripts of the West Semitic area. So I had to give them a quick shout out because they're the only guys in the community that could actually read the languages, and they're actually involved in academia. All right. So now I'm going to go into chapter 4, the pre-Israelite West Semitic religion. And a lot of things being said here, man. Oh, you blew my mind. I had to read this chapter 3 times, man. I didn't get it the first or the second time. I had to read it a third time. Because what I get from this is that, for example, we're going to touch on the Passover first. The Passover, a tradition within the Hebrew culture, we know based off the Exodus, based off Moses going up and getting the 10 Commandments, has to do with the Sukkot and different things. And so we understand the tradition with the worship and the religion of the Israelites, traditionally from the biblical text. But when you pointed out, what's his name, Daniel Fleming's work, which I actually read before your book. So I'm like, when I read it in his book, I'm like, he's just one guy making this up. But to see you use him as a source and added on to it was, gave it some credence to me. And I would love to talk to you about the Ugaritic text, how important and influential it is on the biblical text or the storylines, because you're not saying they copied or whatever. You're basically saying it's a cultural thing where it's not about I'm stealing your ideas or what. This was something prevalent within the Ugaritic culture, and they were a culture that wrote a lot. So you were able to go back with the Rosh Sharma, find in 1929 and find all this stuff. So let's talk about the Passover first and its connection to the Zuku festival.
Yeah. So that text was found only and published only in the 1980s. So it's actually fairly recent in the couple century long history of archaeology as it's been going with relation to Israel and the ancient world. Emar was a city where this text was found, an ancient city from around 1200 BC along the Euphrates River in what is today the country of Syria. And the important thing about this discovery, as well as a number of other texts that were found there, is that these texts show insights from this period into some of the same sorts of concerns and aspects that, as you said, the common culture that we find in Israel. And no text had ever done this before. You mentioned Ugarit. They did it with like the gods and goddesses, but kind of from a different angle. It's almost like you have Israel, you have this Emar text, these texts now, and you have Ugarit, and they're all three legs of a stool to hold it up. And Emar for me was very exciting as I began studying this, and I know Dan Fleming is a very fine scholar, and he did a lot of work on this. Well, but I began studying when I was looking at Leviticus and some of the rituals there of ancient Israel. And let me say, for all of these, you're very right. I don't believe that that Israel copied the culture over, that they simply copied the texts or anything like that. But I do believe this was part of their cultural world. And I believe that they took a number of the things that were present and transformed them to express their own faith and their own particular understanding. And one of these is a background to the Passover. You do find at Emar this what's called the Zukru text. They are festivals. There's one that's a short festival, and it seems to go back several centuries. We have witness to it, and there's a much longer festival that seems to have been developed there at that city. But it's really interesting because you have a special night on the 14th day of the month of preparation and gathering together the materials. And then you have a lamb that is slaughtered. And then you have a special bread that's eaten. And you have a 7-day period after that where this festival is observed. Their god is, their image, their idol of their god is taken out of the city, and his face is covered with a cloth of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think of Exodus and Moses' face, and even the veil of the tabernacle. Anyway, but of course, many of these things are directly connected with the Passover. And the very word we mentioned, Zukru, that's Z-K-R. And those three letters are both found, are not only found at Emar with the meaning of remember or invoke, but they're also found in Israel. This is, the Passover is called a festival of remembrance there in Exodus 12 and 13 and on. And so, and it takes place, some of the festivals, Zukru, take place in the fall. The big one, we're not sure. It may take place in the spring, which would be right at the time of Israel's festival. But I think that these festivals are common, are that Israel is relating to a common festival about this time because it's connected with the barley harvest. And if you look at some of the descriptions in Leviticus 23, Numbers 28 and 29, Deuteronomy 16, and Exodus 23 and 34, what you find is the Passover is mentioned in all those places, but the Feast of Unleavened Bread is also connected with the celebration of the first fruits of the harvest of the barley, which takes place about that time. But I think what Israel then did was they took something like that, but they transformed it to celebrate what they believed was the historic act of God's redemption in bringing them out of Egypt. And that redemptive act was never expressed in Emar, but is clearly there as very much part of the Israelite festival. But what this also shows, and I think it's an important point, is for years, people, traditional Bible critical scholarship sort of picked apart the Passover. And it said, well, you've got this bread. Bread means that this part of the festival came from villagers in Canaan when Israel came and took over the Canaanites. Anyway, it came from them, and they were celebrating their harvest. And then you have the lamb being slaughtered. Well, that comes from a nomadic people. So Israel borrowed that from the nomads, and you had two separate festivals. And then these evolved, and they came together around the 7th century BC. But now what Emar shows us is that you can have the sacrifice of the lamb or slaughter of the lamb, as well as that of the bread being used. And all of these are already all together in 1200 BC, the time of Moses, the time of the birth of Israel, the time when these things come into being. So they didn't have to wait 500 years to put these things together. They're already there, as Emar shows, at the beginning as part of the whole culture around Israel.
Wow. With Emar 446, with Emar 446, you actually touched on both of them. Emar 376. There's so much similarities with the culture of Israel, but you also mentioned from the Eblite time period, 2400 BC, there were certain rituals being done, and there was during the Mari text you found in, I think in 1800 BC, you found also evidence. So these are things and rituals being done before there was even an Israel. So you're saying basically they didn't have to wait 700 years to combine. Some folks who talk about the Passover will say, well, this is an apotropaic rite, and somebody is trying to have some people pass over them. but then they never used to combine both, meaning that they didn't have what you would call the unleavened bread with the other part. So it's always cultures with unleavened bread, but they don't have the other parts of the Passover. So they try to say it was combined, as you said, around the 7th century BC. All right. So let's move on to something because we're at 30 minutes so far. So I want to make sure I keep you in a time. I don't know your schedule. I don't want to disrespect your schedule. I don't know what it is. So I want to keep you at a certain time period today on the show, because there's always a next time, you know? So what about prophecies? You talked about in the same chapter, you talked about prophecies and how in the Mari text, and for those who don't know the Mari text, that's around 1800 BC. A lot of it is collected. You talked about the prophecies that we see, I think, in Jeremiah or different areas. And you talk about different prophecies and how, you know, just like how Israel have prophets and prophecies, other cultures also have it. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, there are bits and pieces of examples of prophecy elsewhere, but prophecy was not unique to Israel. As you mentioned, in the 18th century BC, there is this ancient city called Mari. It sits on the Euphrates River right at the border between Iraq and Syria, just inside Syria. And I mean, it was a major city. The palace there, one of the palaces was some 300 rooms it had in it that the excavators discovered. So it's really a large center. And they found there thousands of tablets. And these tablets reveal a group of people who had names similar in some ways to that of Abram and others of the figures mentioned already in the book of Genesis. So again, the culture is not that different from the culture of what Abram and his successors experienced, especially since their origins also seem to be up there just north of the Euphrates River. So in looking at the question of prophecy, there's maybe, I don't know, 8, 10 more thousand tablets and texts from Mari. Of those, there are a couple hundred letters. And of those letters, there are maybe 57 separate prophecies or references to prophecy, about 60 anyway, that have separate references of prophets at work at Mari. Often the prophets will predict something or say something about what will happen to the king or what will happen in a battle, whether they should go to war or not, but also sometimes about the health and well-being of the royal figures and what is good for them and what is not good for them. Some prophets will do strange things like take a sheep and eat the sheep raw in order to make a point in terms of their prophecy. So there are a number of similarities here with what we find in the Bible in terms of the prophecies that are recorded there. And we know already, even in the Bible, that figures like Balaam, son of Beor, did not come from Israel. He was a prophet, but in Numbers 21 through 24, he comes from the north, from Syria, actually. And so it seems as though Israel is in its prophets and its peoples prophesying, they are part of this culture. Now, it may be that their source of prophecy is different from that of Mari, but many of the same messages are there. Some of the same strange behaviors that you see in a much later figure like Ezekiel and some other prophets in the way they act and the things they do, that was already going on at Mari with some of the prophets there. Interestingly, while it's true that in the Bible we have one or two figures like Huldah who are female and prophets, that seems to be dominant at Mari. Most of the figures there are women who prophesy, but you do have some similarities. Yeah, more so than with some of the other prophetic texts that are found elsewhere in the ancient Near East, I believe.
All right, so let me talk again. Let me let everybody know the book is called Israelite Religions: An Archaeological and Biblical Survey. It is a must read. for anyone who is interested in the Old Testament. Let me just say that. It's a must read. Now, this question, I'm going to read a part of your book, page 187. And this is chapter 4. Treaties. Another source for the official religion of Mary is found in the descriptions of treaty making activities. Anticipating Leviticus 11, the division of clean and unclean animals may be implied in several Mary treaty accounts. On occasions when officials of Mary performed a treaty making ritual with other nations, these groups brought animals such as a puppy, a goat, and a young bull or calf. None of these were acceptable to the Mary officials, who would sacrifice only the fowl of a she-ass in the ritual. Now, I read that to say to you, I noticed you talked about the division of clean and unclean. Many of the folks in my community argue, oh, which culture talks about clean and unclean? And as a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, Aristotle talked about clean and unclean animals also. But we find this in the Mary culture. With the treaties now, I want to refer to Deuteronomy 28. As a matter of fact, you know what? Let's respond to this first, and I'll get to Deuteronomy 28 after. So with the treaties, can you elaborate some more on the treaties and Leviticus 11?
Leviticus. Oh, and the unclean and unclean. Yeah. Yeah, those are the idea of clean and unclean animals is not unknown. It's known not only at Mari, but in a very great civilization that existed between 2000, or really 1700 and 1200 BC, the Hittite civilization, which was centered in Turkey, what is today Turkey. And these peoples all had an idea. They used terms that are corresponding to those terms in the Bible of clean and unclean, that there were certain animals that you could not use for a treaty, that could not be used in any sacred way. There are other certain animals that you would not eat or do other things with. And certainly in the Bible, that seems to be connected, or that seems to be related to the idea of clean and unclean. What is unusual, and possibly part of this is because we have more information in the Bible and more study has been done, a lot of the clean and unclean animals in the Bible, those distinctions go all the way back to Genesis 1 within the Bible itself, where you have the division between the sky, the seas, and the dry land. And Mary Douglas, who I think is the major figure who did a lot of anthropological study, noted that clean and unclean in Leviticus 11 has a lot to do with whether these animals have locomotion that corresponds to the world in which they were created. So, for example, birds with wings and feathers are often clean, but birds that have wings that can't fly, like the ostrich, is unclean. Fish that have scales and fins are clean, but fish or sea creatures that move back and forth between the waters and the dry land and don't have those scales of it, like snails and salamanders and whatnot, they're unclean. And so you do have a certain set of categories there, which you don't have in some of these other, as well as we can see. But what does seem to be common among the Hittites at Mari and in Israel is that the animals that were used for sacrifice and slaughter often were those that were most close, the closest to the peoples concerned. This is why, for example, among the Israelites, cattle and sheep, which they, from as far back in their history as you can go, they were herders, sheep herders. They were taking care of cattle and bulls and things like this. Those animals were very close, and so they could be used in sacrifices in other places as a substitute for them. Whereas an animal like a camel that comes along much later was always kind of peripheral. That was not used in this way. It was considered unclean. The use of animals in treaties goes back to, often they would sacrifice an animal as part of an oath And this happens in Genesis 15, where God says, take these animals and cut them in two. And then he symbolically passes through them in making his promise. And in part, what he's saying is, if I don't fulfill my promise, then may I be like these animals. I am basing my life upon this promise. And that's what two parties in a treaty would do. They would say, we are guaranteeing this. And to symbolize that we are guaranteeing it with our life, we sacrifice, we cut an animal in this way and kill it.
Wow. You know, what's fascinating, your book, I mean, I don't think there's any book that has really helped me improving on my growth or improving on my studies more than your book. I've read a lot of books about Old Testament, and this is why I recommend it. This is a book, if you're really interested in the Old Testament, it's not about copying, because I used to be a guy that said, oh, the Bible is copying this, it's copying that. But when you look at acculturation and look at the culture of Canaan and look at how people just been traveling through this area for thousands of years, there's no reason why someone wouldn't gravitate to something that's working. So whether it's the Hittite culture, whether it's the Egyptian culture, whether it's the old Assyrian culture or the Sumerian culture, people always gravitate to greatness. I want to know what these guys are doing. They're unwittingly spies for other cultures and don't know. But let's move on to something important. This is very important for my community. Deuteronomy 28. It talks about blessings and curses.
Yeah.
Some people in my community believe it's talking about them today in a sense, yes. But before we get into that, I do want to emphasize, I've been talking about chapter 4 the whole time, but this is actually regarding chapter 3, because you actually referred back to chapter 3 from chapter 4. Wow. Because you were talking about a little bit about the treaties, and he said refer back to my earlier chapter. So one of the 6 points you brought out in chapter 3, you said it's more controversial. It has been argued that Deuteronomy, by the way, this is page 105, argued that Deuteronomy occurs in the form of a treaty document or covenant. The biblical concept of covenant or berit has a claim to antiquity in the world of ancient Israel. The same is true of the ancient Near Eastern treaty. And I want everybody to listen to this. Some 80 or 90 examples of treaties made between 2400 BC and 650 BC are preserved. These divide into two groups. Those treaties made with the Hittites between 1400 and 1200 BC, and those from the regions dominated by the Neo-Assyrian Empire between the 9th and the 7th centuries BC. Such treaties between states served to define their relationships. There were two types of treaties. The first became known as the parity treaty because it was made between two powers of equal strength. And for those who don't know about the Hittite treaty, you're talking about the Hittites with, I would assume, not looking at your book, based off memory, that you're talking about Egypt and the Egyptian and the Hittites when Ramesses II and some people gave up their daughters and those type of things. So this was going on during a time period when Egypt was pretty much in the early stages. You'd have like the Proto-Israelite stage and so forth. And that was the type of treaty that the Hittites did when you have equal power. So you're talking like if the Persian Empire and the Assyrian Empire had a treaty while they were on top, or the Greeks and the Persians. But with the other treaty, and without going too further into your book, it would be about a king, an empire over a vassal kingdom, like Assyria over Israel. Israel was a vassal kingdom, and Assyria was the empire at the time who was in control over the ancient Near East. Now, I say all of that to say Deuteronomy 28 is about curses and blessings. And what influence do you think the Neo-Assyrian treaties had on Deuteronomy compared to the Hittites? Because I know you made a very strong case for the Hittites want to be very influential. My thinking is these things are passed on from empires to empires, and I wouldn't be surprised if the both had influence on the biblical writers, because the biblical writers were very intelligent, extremely intelligent. But go ahead, my brother. You could elaborate on it.
Well, I think that the book of Deuteronomy is has at its sort of core what would be called the suzerain vassal treaty, which is different from what you mentioned, the parity. The vassal treaties, there's most of treaties that are found in the ancient world are vassal, because in most cases you don't have two equals that fight and come out equal. You usually have one power conquering another. And just by the accidents of archaeology, these treaties were probably written at all times and throughout the history of these political powers. But by the accidents of archaeology, we have a lot preserved from the Hittites from that earlier period that you mentioned, and a lot preserved from the Neo-Assyrians from the later period that you mentioned. And what is different when you look at those two vassal treaties? There's a structure that's consistent in the dozens and dozens of treaties that we have that are vassal treaties. In the Hittite vassal treaty, you have the title identifying the sovereign, the emperor, as it were. You have a historical background which says, look, as long as we have been loyal, you have been loyal to me, vassal, over the past so many generations. I've been loyal to you, even your father and your grandfather. In fact, I helped set you up on the throne to guarantee it. So the historical background becomes a motivation to be loyal. You have then the specific stipulations, which are usually centered around loyalty and, extradition. If somebody from my country escapes to yours and I want them, you got to bring them back to me, that kind of thing. And then you have what are blessings and curses that regularly appear. Blessings because, and with that, or even before that, you have a god list. You have a list of the gods of both groups, so that these gods will be watching over us to guarantee this treaty, because the Hittite emperor can't be there all the time. And then you have the blessings and cursings, blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. Those are 5 elements that are consistent in virtually every vassal treaty among the Hittites, 1400 to 1200 BC. Now, among the Assyrians, you have a difference. Centuries later, in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Assyrian vassal treaties do have a title. They give the title of the Assyrian emperor, but they don't have any historical background. They don't do that. They don't bother with that. They go right into the laws, the stipulations, and then they go from there to the gods. They list the gods, and then they have curses, but they don't have any blessings. There are no blessings in the Hittite. It's kind of like, well, you better obey because we're coming after you if you don't. So they only have those elements. They're missing the historical prologue and the blessings. Now go to Deuteronomy and look at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy has the introductory couple of verses at the beginning, which identifies Moses and then identifies the Lord as speaking through Moses as kind of the sovereign. Mm-hmm. He's the sovereign and Israel's the vassal here. Mm-hmm. And then in chapters 1 through 3, you have a historical background of everything that happened up until Moses and Israel are getting ready to cross over the Jordan River, from Sinai to that time. Then from chapters 4 through 26, 27, you have all the stipulations, all the laws, and a lot of them have to do with being loyal to God and worshiping only God. In fact, that's a big part of it. Then in chapter, and you don't have a list of gods, obviously, because for Israel, there's only one God, and he's the sovereign making the treaty. And then in chapter 28, you have blessings and curses. You have the first 15 verses are blessings, and then it goes into a long set of verses that are curses. So when I look at this and I compare it to the Hittite treaty and I compare it to the structure of the Assyrian treaty, it looks a lot more like that earlier Neo-Hittite treaty, or not Neo, but Hittite treaty. And that's why I set it situated there. If I look at the Assyrian treaties, there are some similarities with some of the curses. You do get some very colorful, similar curses that they make that are found in Deuteronomy 28. So there certainly seems to be some things there. But the overall structure, it doesn't occur in the first millennium BC. It occurs 1400 BC, 1300, 1200 BC, right around the time that Moses would have been living and writing, or a figure like him.
Okay.
That's my take on it, in terms of my perspective.
Beautiful, beautiful. We just hit the 50-minute mark. Do you have an extra 50 minutes that we could talk some more? Does that fit into your schedule?
Yeah, I can spend another few minutes.
Mm-hmm. All right. By the way, let me show the cover of your book so people could see what the book looks like. And this book, Israelite Religions, it refers to a lot of, I don't know how great you are with West Semitic languages, but you do refer us to the primary and the sources very well. So
yeah, I did my doctorate in those languages, so I've had some study.
He's like, I had some study. So humble. All right. Hold on. Let me see if I could get this cover on the screen. Okay, let me do it this way. All right. Let me see if I could do it this way. All right. Let's make it bigger. All right. Here we go. I'm going to share what the book looks like. Let's do this. Hold on a second. Oh, I'm having you know what? I'm not even going to try. You guys.
This is what it looks like.
Thank you. Thank you. Hey, see, that was the easier way. I don't know why I'm going here. The author's right here, and I'm trying to go around trying to find the book. But that's what it looks like, family. It has hundreds of pages of knowledge and information we all should read. And by the way, I am a big proponent of the Assyrian connection, and I think your view is so balanced. There's no reason for me to disagree with you unless I just have a bias. And I got to be honest about it. The Hittite treaty is basically, for those who don't understand, is for empires with empires. But the structure of Deuteronomy, the only place you really find an influence in Deuteronomy is actually two places. Deuteronomy 13, they connect that with the Neo-Assyrian treaty. And I think Deuteronomy 28. So those two chapters are the only two chapters. Otherwise, the structure of the entire writing of Deuteronomy actually follows an older tradition of treaties. Let me put it that way, instead of just saying the Hittites, but an older tradition. All right? Just to make it clear for everyone. And the reason why there's a conversation, because, of course, the orthodoxy, for the folks who believe the Bible is the word of God and 100% true, would lean more into something was written during the time of when Moses in the story would exist. And for those who deal with like a centrist point of view, like a Finkelstein, some of those type of guys, they would lean to say, hey, you know what, Deuteronomy, some of it, not all of it, some of it was written during the 7th century around that time period. So that's where, there's controversy or arguments in academia. That's what we, the little people, don't argue about. We allow Dr. Hess and other people to argue about that type of stuff. But, and again, it boils down to methodology, which anyone who reads this book, you have to read. Don't go to a specific chapter. Read chapter 1 and 2 because it breaks down the methodology and how it comes to certain conclusions. All right. Now, moving forward, let me see if there's any argument. So pretty much you're a guy that could read a lot of different languages. So you're able to actually go into the Ugaritic and actually see the text and translate it yourself. So you don't need to read Daniel Fleming's or take his word. You could see it for yourself. Do you think it's better for folks who are practice? Oh, you know what? Before I even go into anything, what is the difference between a curse and a prophecy? Because in Deuteronomy 28, you have from verse 16 to 68, it curses. And people in the United States of America, from the African American community, they're saying that these are like prophecies. that apply, curses that apply to them, and it's a fulfillment. I am saying it's someone who is writing back then, whether it's the 7th century BC or in the 14th century BC. The person is writing about something happening at that time, because you see it in the context of somebody writing in the present tense, not in the, say, in a futuristic sense. What do you say about that?
Well, I think the nature of curses is such that it is negative, and it's a warning. It's designed as a warning that if you do certain things or don't do certain things, then all of this bad stuff is going to come upon you. We find a lot of curses in the ancient world, as I guess in the modern world too. But you find them, for example, written on people's tombs, warning the onlooker or the visitor not to touch the tomb, because often there are valuables buried with the person who died in ancient times, especially kings' tombs and things like this. And there are curses if you do that. If you touch it, then this and this and this, may all of this come upon you. Now, a curse isn't a prophecy that necessarily says for that kind of curse. It's just a wish or even a prayer that a bad thing will happen. Deuteronomy 28 is slightly different because it's presented as the word of God, and as the word of God, both the blessings, which are good things if you live a certain way and believe certain things, and the curses, which are bad things if you live a different way, are presented as coming from God. Therefore, it's pretty sure that that's what's going to happen if you follow these bad roads and live in this way. And that's why a number of the things in Deuteronomy 28 are or have been and can be connected with what happens to Israel later, as its country is destroyed, it's taken captive into Babylon. There is a period of time when there is no longer a temple or a place to worship God. A number of these things seem to be hinted at, or even more, spoken of in Deuteronomy 28. So that's sort of how I would understand it.
Okay. All right. Let me go back to my notes for a second here. Someone is actually asking if who was when you went to Wheaton, right? Did you go?
I did, yeah.
Right. Who was your biggest influence or favorite teacher at Wheaton?
They all were. Well, I'll tell you. I put it this way. I had a teacher named Alfred Hurt, who passed away recently, who taught me to love archaeology and the study of the ancient world. I had a teacher named Arthur Ruprecht, who was a Greek teacher, who taught me to love the classics and reading Greek. And I had my Hebrew teacher was Hassel Bullock, and he taught me to love Hebrew. And that's how I usually try to describe that. They were all good teachers. They all taught me a lot of information and were helpful and have been. But I think the communication of the passion, the love for the discipline was so important in every one of their lives.
Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some questions from the audience to see, and I'm going to send you a copy of this video so you could see how well you came out.
Oh, I never like to look at myself.
Well, someone is asking a question, but I'm going to answer it for you. Pascal Okoli asks, please, Garfield, ask him of his opinion of the Bible being true word of the Creator God. All right. Before Dr. Hess came on, all right. Dr. Hess works for Denver Seminary. And if someone works for the seminary, more than likely they are basically what some would call an orthodox or fundamentalist believer in the Bible. So whether he believes the Bible is the word of God, I'm not going to ask him that question, because I think his work speaks for itself in that sense. And I really don't want to talk about belief, by the way, too. So, but if the doctor want to answer it, I mean, he could answer it.
Well, I do believe the Bible is the Word of God, but I wrote the book Israelite Religions from in an attempt to not make that a significant part of the book. This book, I would argue, the argument presented in the book, the evidence, the conclusions, stand on their own, whatever your belief is. And I really tried to make it that way. I've written other books and some commentaries where I've certainly gone in the direction of, yes, I believe this way, and therefore this is the implication of that. But Israelite Religions is not like that. I really tried to be as objective in writing that as I could.
Yes. What do you think about? Would you say it would be easier for someone to accept the Israelite religion than, say, Christianity in itself, because of how historical Jesus is looked on as far as an individual we looked on in history? Do you think that it's easier for a Christian than it is for an Israelite? Because, you know, most of the mainstream archaeology, and they would look at some of the characters in the Bible from a historical or archaeological perspective, as like a William Dever. He said, you know what, looking for the patriots is a done deal. I'm not looking for them anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I say, being a Christian, wouldn't it? I think it's easier for a Christian. I don't know what your view would be.
Well, if what you mean is that the evidence outside of the Bible for the existence of Jesus Christ as an individual, as a person, and having an impact is stronger than, say, Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, yeah, I think so. You can say that for sure. In that sense, it is more compelling to accept. But then neither Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or any of those claimed to rise from the dead, whereas Jesus did.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get into a discussion about that, but that's not something that you can, prove in a laboratory or something like that. So there are easier aspects in terms of accepting by faith, but there are bigger issues in terms of what you have to accept as far as the claims of Christianity make.
Wow, good point. Good point. What's your next? Oh, by the way, you did do a writing on Genesis 1 to 11. If you do decide to come back on my platform and do an interview, I do want to talk about the primeval history and the names, which I never knew you did it until, a couple of weeks ago. So that's something I would definitely, we're probably going to have a 2-hour conversation on that, because Genesis 1 to 11 and the Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the flood story, everything, we have so much to cover on that. What is the project that you're working on currently or hoping to work on in the future, as far as writing a book?
Right. Well, the main thing I'm working on now is a commentary on the books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, and looking at the biblical text and trying to produce something that will hold together to explain and to understand what's going on there and what the text is teaching, and also what it looks like in its original environment and context.
Right. What advice would you have for anyone who is interested in getting into archaeology or history, or trying to go back to school to get their master's or PhD in the topic as far as biblical history or biblical archaeology? What advice would you have for them?
I would encourage people to sort of count the cost. If you're going to do it, I mean, I kind of devoted much of my life to this, so it's a major investment. You can learn a lot, like you say, reading a book, reading different things. They're very valuable and very helpful. But if you actually want to go into the field to study it, to teach, to research and write on it, then you really need to begin with the preparation and the kind of discipline of studying the languages, working with the different aspects of archaeology and understanding them. It's a large, and keeping an open mind and looking at the differing views that are presented.
I was listening to a YouTube video you did recently. I was listening to recent. It's not recent though, about Daniel 9, and that's a whole nother show altogether by itself. Um, that's another topic for another time. But let me ask you this question. Someone asked a question. When we read the Bible and its setting is the ancient Near East, what would you consider the world at that time, not including sub-Saharan Africa, not including North America, South America, Northern Asia, Northern Europe? Would you see the setting, basically the world, in a setting just of the ancient Near East?
What do you?
All right, let me reword the question.
Yeah.
When the setting of the Bible in itself, would you agree that the setting is basically the ancient Near East and Northern Africa? Would you agree that's what pretty much the setting was?
Yeah, it is. That's the immediate setting for almost all the events, certainly in the Old Testament, and I guess a lot in the New too. But, you know, you can look at texts like Genesis 10, which is a table of the known nations of the world. I mean, you don't have East Asia included, you don't have Europe included. You certainly have sub-Saharan going down into what would have been called Kush or Nubia or today Sudan and that region.
Mm-hmm.
You have the connections with the Horn of Africa and Yemen and that region there, both in terms of spices and other things that are known, as well as, of course, the famous connection with the Queen of Sheba, which seems to come from there. So, yeah, overall, I would say generally you're right. I would say in Africa, it extends a little bit farther south, maybe there, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. All right. So Dr. Richard S. Hess, let me put the S there so you don't get it mixed up. Dr. Richard S. Hess, the writer of Israelite Religions. I want to say thank you for coming on and taking the time out to be the first guest in my Scholars 20 for 20 in Black History Month. And I want to say you're welcome anytime to come back on. I would definitely love to talk about the primeval history in Genesis, and from Genesis 1 to 11, and get really deep into the names and so forth in what you specialize in. All right. So I want to say thank you for taking out the time, and keep writing them books and keep putting out the great information that you're putting on.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot, Garfield. I enjoyed our time together.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right, everybody. That's it for today. This is number 1, February 1st. Tomorrow, Mr. Dennis McDonald is supposed to be on, but because I'm stuck in Florida because of the snowstorm, I'm going to be on Friday. He's going to come on. I'm going to do 2 shows on Friday. He's going to be on at 11:30 in the morning, and I'm going to have Dr. Bowen on in the evening at 7 p.m. All right. Peace and love to everybody, and thank you for listening. Share the show, like the show. Peace.